Hey, everybody, welcome back to More to It. My name is Jason McConnell, and I'm one of the hosts of our show. I've also got Todd Norton with me. He's my intrepid co host, but today he's actually also our guest because he knows a lot about something that I want to know more about, and that's risk. So, Todd, it seems as though whenever I hear people talking about risk, folks are using that word to mean different things. What does risk mean, and how do people use that word differently? Are there different meanings?
There are, and I think there are. And thanks very much, by the way, for letting me talk on the topic for a little bit. And there's a lot of interest in risk. There's an increase in interest in risk, and certainly understandable. It's become more common, just even in the media or in our public discourse today. There are different meanings in a couple of different ways. One is I think people commonly use the term risk to actually stand for different things, right? So the first might be hazard, right? That is the presence of a hazard out there in the objective world, right? That is, radiation as an example, right? That's something out there in the world, and we have that's a hazard, the presence of a hazard. And the second might be, might use the term vector, right? That is, how do we become exposed to that hazard that's out there, right? And then the third is what impact might that have on us, right? And so that's actually a little bit more complicated formula than just saying, like, there's a risk involved there. Well, it sort of depends on what kind of risk that is, what the hazard actually is, and how it impacts us. So that would all be on what you might sort of summarize as a technical orientation to risk, right? That is, there are hazards out there, and you could do some level of quantitative analysis and understand sort of what your actual exposure is, right? And if that makes sense. But there's a different approach to risk, which is you might think of it more as a cultural approach to risk. That is, what are our understandings of those things, and what is all of the social science around how we respond to those, right? And that's actually a whole nother complicated area. Both areas are interesting, and both are complicated in themselves, right? So there's some research, for example, that looks at the uncertainty levels or the concern levels for people who live closer to a hazard rather than further away. Now, if you looked at it from a technical perspective, you'd probably think, well, living closer to a smokestack that's producing a certain amount of environmental pollution would actually increase your level of concern. But the actual opposite is the case. The closer people live to it, actually, uncertainty about that thing actually reduces slightly. Point being is that sort of a technical orientation to risk and a cultural orientation to risk both exist, and both have a number of complicating factors.
That's super interesting. And I hadn't heard a technical explanation of that proximity notion before, but it makes sense to me. I live in Wyoming.
Mm-hmm.
Frequently people come to visit and they say things like, "Hey man, aren't you worried about that super volcano?" No.
Sure.
Honestly, we don't talk about it. If it cooks off, we're probably toast. But we don't really talk about it much. So, all right, I got a follow-up question. So you, in talking about how people differentiate their ideas about risk, it made me wonder, do organizations and individuals tend to talk about and think about risk very differently from each other? Is that a thing?
I don't know. I think what might be maybe what's interesting about that is the way that they might be similar, and we could think about some differences. But what might be similar is, for example, a level of risk aversion, right? So how risk averse, and a risk aversion would be similar in both an individual and an organization. There's certainly a collective dynamic involved in risk, right? Sort of like, as more people are involved, we might be more willing to do more risky behavior as an individual. But both organizations and individuals, or even small groups of individuals, orient around various hazards, if you will, right? They do various sort of risky behaviors, and those behaviors are often made sense of as a level of how risk averse are we, right? And so I suspect if you looked at a particular case example, there's a level of risk averseness that becomes normal, whether that's an individual organ or an organization. Sorry, I didn't say that very well, right? And so we get used to patterns of behavior, and so those patterns of behavior probably, even if they are very risky, probably may not be seen as risky because we're so accustomed to doing them.
Okay, so this is the dynamic like you see folks working on high steel, building giant buildings, skyscrapers and whatnot. Folks are way off the ground and they're just walking along. That would freak me out, by the way.
Absolutely.
But I think that's what you're talking about.
Yeah, and that's actually a useful example, right? So if you look at that, you can say, well, that example would scare the bejeebers out of me, right? That would be a very scary, right? I would be very risk averse to standing at an elevation that's really high. Yeah. And yet many of us, and you could actually let's take two situations that are actually quite analogous: flying in a plane or driving in a car, right? Okay. If you ask the vast majority of people, if you ask which of those two things are more scary, right? Which are more risky? Which one is more risky? Almost everybody would report that flying in a plane is actually far more risky, right? It feels more risky than driving in a car, but statistically speaking, driving in a car is actually far more hazardous, right? I mean, the chances of getting, seriously injured or being involved in a plane crash, not even a plane crash, but in a plane accident, right, is, one in, several hundred thousands, maybe even millions, depending on whether you're talking about wrecks or accidents or crashes. The chances of being involved in an automobile crash is about 1 in 55 to 65, depending on the year.
Huh.
So statistically speaking, from a technical perspective, it's far more risky to drive a car, but people don't feel that way. And part of the reason that people don't feel that way, so part of it is a risk averse aspect. The other part of that is, right, this is another social dynamic, and it relates to your question both about individuals and organizations, is a feeling of being in control, right? Okay. Even if it's not true, we have a feeling of being in control. And so therefore it feels less risky to us because we feel like we're in control, whether that matters or not. Because lots of people are involved in lots of car accidents that their level of control had no impact on the fact that they got into an accident because somebody ran into them.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, so that makes me wonder, how do we go about striking a balance? We engage in behaviors that are risky. We got other things on our mind that are important to us. How do we strike some sort of balance between risk and other considerations?
I think the most interesting aspect of that, it's an interesting question, right? I mean, because all of us strike a balance and we can recognize that, right? We're willing to take certain risks, right? That is to expose ourselves to certain hazards or certain risky situations in our individual lives. I think the part of your question that's the most interesting, and apologies if I'm taking it in a direction you didn't want to go, is how do we make that balance with the people around us? That's actually that becomes a really challenging point, right? Because you living in your own life decide to, you really like meat, for example, that's charbroiled, right? And so there's a certain risk involved in that, right? Or you really enjoy spending lots of time on the water. Well, that exposes you to certain types of risk, right? Or certain hazards. And in your own life, that's not that big of a deal. Or if you're around all the people that you're around have a similar sort of risk orientation, then you're good to go. I think the challenge comes when your risk orientation is not the same as other people's risk orientation, right? And that could come in a variety of flavors. One is, how risk averse are you, right? Another is that risk seen as normal or a normal part of your experience? And your skyscraper example is a good example of that, right? If you walked on skyscrapers your entire life, and even use a more everyday example, if your family was into roofing houses and you spent the vast majority of your time crawling up and down 30 or 40 foot ladders and hanging over the edge of a roof, that's no big deal because you've been doing it your entire life. On the other side, if you don't do that until you're 25 years old, that's going to be a very scary experience. statistically, the chances of those two people falling is probably about, roughly the same. Right. And so that also changes things. It's also true that how people view other, various types of hazards differ. Right. And so human beings are wonderful because we're all, we're chock full of all sorts of contradictions and, overlapping sort of inconsistencies in our logic. Right. And so the same person who might find that eating, charbroiled food is really problematic might do something else that you look at and say, well, why are you doing something that's so risky? Right. So, so we manage risks in different sorts of ways. And so that can become challenging. Right. So I think that matters, for example, when you think about how public health discussions have gone recently. Right. And so, I'm going to oversimplify and, excuse me for doing so. On one side, one risk orientation might be concerned about not wearing a mask or getting a vaccine or not getting a vaccine, right? Because, getting a vaccine has been demonstrated, to reduce the impact of it, of COVID-19 and so on and so forth. And the same conversation was happening 10 to 15 years ago with people concerned about MMR vaccinations, right? That conversation was a really prominent issue for the better part of 10 years. All right. Another risk orientation might be looking at the lack of long-term study about various types of vaccines and such, right? And so you end up with almost a perfect recipe for two people or two groups of people who have different orientations on risk or hazards in two different directions, and then they're opposed, right? So then they end up coming off as sort of being opposed to one another, when in reality, they're probably both sort of genuinely oriented, at least on many people, I think, are genuinely oriented around being concerned about various things, right? And so a challenge in managing those sorts of discussions is, of course, better data about sort of the technical factors, the technical risk associated. But it's also, right, so that's one answer. Another aspect of that is, and it's going to take some humanity on our part, is to better appreciate that just because somebody has a different risk orientation to me doesn't mean they're trying to be belligerent or just be confrontational to my approach, right? So you might, you think that masks, I'll just use you and I as an example, right? You might look at the vaccine and think, well, that seems nonsensical because of X, Y, and Z, right? And I might look at it and say not getting the vaccine might be nonsensical because of X, Y, and Z. How do we facilitate better conversations and appreciating the fact that we have different risk orientations?
So thinking about vaccines and masks and all of that kind of debate, I think that's a really timely example of how people perceive risk exposure differently. Do you think the pandemic has changed the way folks think about risk? Because it certainly dominates conversations. Do you think it's changed the way all of us conceptualize risk?
I think I don't know if it's changed the way we think about it. It certainly seems to have changed the way we talk about it, to the degree that those sorts of open conversations, right, are more common, it seems like, right? Yeah. And so if you're going to get together, for example, with somebody and go out for dinner, right? Well, before you might just have assumed you're going to go out for dinner. You didn't wonder whether you were going to wear a mask or not, and now you might. You didn't wonder whether you were going to sit inside or outside, but now you might. You didn't wonder whether there was going to be a mask mandate or not a mask mandate, or you didn't probably wonder you didn't wonder, for example, how high the flu numbers were, right? And so my point is not to draw a direct comparison between the flu and COVID. That's not my point at all. But to draw a comparison to, I think it's more common today, and we're sort of leaning into becoming more comfortable with just having open and honest conversation, right? Certainly people are now going to visit family now that we're, a year and a half or so out. Vaccinations are starting to become more common. People are now starting to go and visit one another. I'm sure there are thousands, if not millions of people who have gone and visited a relative who wasn't vaccinated, or somebody who was vaccinated who was going to, going from one state to another. I think it makes those conversations just more commonplace in our society. And that, I think, is a change. And that's a change that's hard to lean into, right? There's some level of, not uncomfort necessarily, but it's become a more common conversation. Whether it's changed us individually or not, I don't know. That's not really my area of expertise, but I certainly think that it's become a more common conversation. And so we're now talking about risk more openly. In part, at the same time, I mean, we've always had those sort of situations where we talked about risk. I mean, because you could go back in, I mean, not even that much history, and there was risk associated with certain types of investment, right? There's risk associated with buying a house and whether the market was going up or down. There's risk in going into a certain type of occupation. So one of the things I think that's interesting about risk is it's pervasive across really, it's not a public health issue. There's risk as associated with business decisions. There's risk associated with an individual investment. Risk is really this pervasive issue that, sort of it touches every part of our lives. And it's for that, it's interesting.
I think it's super interesting. Thanks so much for chatting with me about it today.
It's a real pleasure.
I am afraid we are out of time, though. So we'll stop right here. Hey, everybody, thanks for tuning in. We look forward to visiting with you very soon. See ya.
Thanks, everybody. The views, thoughts, analysis, and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the authors and the podcast participants. They do not necessarily reflect the opinions or views of Boise State University, the University of Wyoming, the Idaho State Board of Education, or the University of Wyoming Board of Regents. No endorsement of the material contained in this podcast by those entities is implied.